The truth does not ask for permission before it changes a life. It simply arrives and destroys everything that was built on silence. Inside the grand hall of the Meridian Estate Hotel, the wedding of Ethan Carter and Isabella Moore was reaching the moment everyone had been waiting for. Crystal chandeliers shimmered above rows of seated guests. Soft classical music filled the air, and the atmosphere carried the controlled elegance of a high society union between two powerful families. Ethan Carter stood at the altar in a perfectly tailored black tuxedo, his posture steady, his expression calm, but his eyes carried a distant focus that even the guests closest to him had begun to notice. Beside him, Isabella Moore stood in a white designer gown, her smile carefully maintained for the cameras and the expectations of everyone present. No one expected anything to disturb this moment. No one expected anything to challenge the perfection being displayed. Then the doors at the back of the hall slowly opened. The sound was subtle at first, almost polite, but it carried through the silence like a break in reality. Every head in the room turned at once. Standing at the entrance was Ava Johnson, dressed in a simple black outfit that immediately separated her from the world she had just entered. In her hands, she carried a sealed envelope, held tightly as if it contained something that could not be dropped under any circumstance. She did not hesitate. She did not look around. She walked forward with steady steps, moving directly down the center aisle as whispers began to rise around her. Guests leaned toward each other, trying to understand who she was and why she had been allowed inside. Isabella's smile slowly faded as she watched the woman approach. Ethan remained still, but something in his expression shifted slightly, as if recognition and uncertainty were beginning to collide in his mind. Ava stopped only when she reached halfway down the aisle. The music had stopped completely by then, leaving only silence and the faint sound of breathing from hundreds of guests. She raised the envelope slightly, making it visible to everyone. Her voice was calm when she finally spoke, but it carried through the hall with unmistakable clarity. She said she was not there to interrupt the wedding. That single sentence made several guests relax slightly, but only for a moment, because what she said next changed everything. She said she had come because a child named Liam Harper was lying in a hospital bed, asking every night when his father would come to see him. The name did not belong to this room, but it landed in it like a weight that could not be ignored. Ethan's expression changed immediately. Not dramatically, but enough for the closest guests to notice the shift. Isabella turned toward him, searching his face for answers he had not yet given. Ava held the envelope steady and said it contained a DNA test, confirming a biological connection between Ethan Carter and the child. The silence that followed was absolute. It was no longer a wedding waiting to continue. It was a moment suspended between denial and truth, where every person in the room understood that nothing would ever return to what it was before. For a moment after Ava Johnson's words settled into the silence, no one in the room moved. The grand wedding hall, once filled with soft music and controlled elegance, now felt completely suspended in disbelief. Ethan Carter remained standing at the altar, his gaze fixed on the envelope she held, as if it had become the only object in the world that mattered. Isabella Moore turned toward him slowly, her expression tightening as she searched his face for any sign of denial or explanation. But Ethan did not speak. Instead, he took a single step forward, breaking the stillness that had frozen everyone else in place. His voice, when it finally came, was low and controlled, asking Ava to repeat what she had just said. Ava did not hesitate. She repeated that the envelope contained a verified DNA test confirming that he was the biological father of a child named Liam Harper. The sound of that name again caused a ripple of reaction through the guests, but Ethan no longer seemed focused on the room around him. Isabella stepped closer to him and asked in a quiet but tense voice if this was some kind of misunderstanding. She reminded him that they were standing in the middle of their wedding, that nothing like this had ever been mentioned before. Ethan still did not respond to her directly. His attention remained locked on Ava, as if trying to determine whether the truth in her words could be trusted. Then one of the guests, an older man seated near the front, spoke up and demanded clarification, suggesting that such a claim could not be accepted without immediate verification. The tension in the room shifted again, becoming heavier as uncertainty replaced shock. Ava finally took another step forward and extended the envelope toward Ethan. She said she did not expect anyone to believe her without seeing the documents. She explained that the test had been conducted through a certified medical facility and cross-verified through hospital records connected to Mercy Children's Hospital. The mention of the hospital name caused Ethan to pause. It was subtle, but unmistakable. Isabella noticed it immediately and turned her head slightly toward him again, her voice softer now as she asked if there was anything in his past he had never told her. Ethan slowly reached out and took the envelope from Ava's hands. The moment his fingers closed around it, the entire room seemed to tighten again, as if waiting for the next breath to decide what kind of future this wedding would have. He did not open it immediately. Instead, he looked at the sealed edges, as if recognizing that whatever was inside could not be reversed once seen. Ava remained still, watching him carefully, while Isabella stood beside him, her expression caught between disbelief and growing fear of confirmation. Ethan finally broke the seal. The sound of paper opening echoed faintly through the hall, and every guest instinctively leaned forward. Inside were documents, printed reports, and a photograph of a small child with soft features and a quiet gaze. Ethan's eyes moved slowly across the page, absorbing numbers, confirmations, and the undeniable conclusion written in clinical certainty. Isabella looked at the documents over his shoulder and felt her breath catch as the meaning became impossible to ignore. The DNA result confirmed a biological match, at a level that left no room for doubt. For the first time since the ceremony began, Ethan Carter did not look like a man standing in control of his life. He looked like someone standing at the edge of a reality he had never prepared for. And in that moment, the wedding that was meant to define his future began to quietly collapse under the weight of a truth that had just been placed in his hands. The sound of the paper being unfolded inside Ethan Carter's hands seemed louder than anything else in the wedding hall. Every guest remained frozen in place, watching as the truth printed on those pages slowly changed the atmosphere from disbelief into irreversible tension. Ethan's eyes moved across the report again, not because he doubted it, but because his mind was trying to reconcile what it meant. The DNA confirmation, the medical verification, and the attached documentation formed a conclusion that could not be dismissed. Behind him, Isabella Moore stepped closer, her voice trembling slightly as she asked him what it said. Ethan did not answer immediately. Instead, he lowered the papers slightly, as if the weight of them required space just to exist. Ava Johnson stood still in the center aisle, her expression calm but attentive, watching every reaction carefully. The room felt smaller now, as if the walls themselves had moved inward. One of the guests stood up and demanded that the situation be explained properly, suggesting that a wedding could not simply be interrupted by an unverified claim. Another guest agreed, but their voices lacked conviction, as if they already sensed the answer would not help restore order. Ethan finally spoke, his voice quieter than before. He said the test indicated a biological match with a child named Liam Harper. The moment the name was spoken again, the emotional weight in the room deepened. Isabella's expression tightened as she processed the implication, her earlier confidence beginning to fracture under the reality forming in front of her. She asked Ethan if he had ever heard of this child before, if there was anything in his past that had been hidden from her. Ethan's silence was long enough to answer the question without words. Ava stepped forward slightly and explained that the child was currently at Mercy Children's Hospital under medical care, and that he had been asking for his father consistently. Her voice remained steady, but there was an underlying softness that suggested she was not there to create conflict, only to deliver truth. Ethan slowly closed the folder, holding it now as if it had become heavier than before. He turned his head slightly toward Ava and asked one question, asking who had initiated the DNA test. Ava replied that it had been arranged through hospital verification after a cross-reference was made with records connected to the child's mother, Natalie Harper. The mention of the name caused a visible shift in Ethan's expression. It was subtle, but it was enough for Isabella to notice immediately. She stepped back slightly, her eyes narrowing as she tried to piece together fragments of information she had never been given. Ethan's mind drifted briefly, as if something buried deep within him had been touched without warning. A memory, not fully formed, but enough to disturb his composure. The guests were no longer whispering. They were watching, waiting for a reaction that would define what kind of ending this wedding would have. Ethan finally exhaled slowly, placing the documents back into the envelope. He looked at Isabella, then at Ava, and then toward the empty space ahead of him, as if visualizing a path that had suddenly split into two completely different futures. One tied to the life he had planned, and one tied to a child he had never known but could no longer ignore. And in that silence, before any decision was spoken aloud, it became clear that the ceremony was no longer about marriage, but about truth that refused to be contained any longer. The silence inside the wedding hall stretched longer than anyone thought possible. Ethan Carter stood holding the envelope, but his focus was no longer on the physical document alone. It was on everything it represented. The guests remained frozen in their seats, their earlier confidence replaced with uncertainty as they waited for him to respond. Isabella Moore watched him closely, her hands trembling, slightly at her sides, her voice no longer demanding but fragile when she asked him what he was going to do. Ethan did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked down at the documents once more, as if searching for something beyond the printed confirmation. Ava Johnson stood quietly in the aisle, her role now reduced to observation rather than interruption, her expression calm but heavy with understanding. Finally, Ethan spoke. His voice was controlled but noticeably lower than before. He said that if what was written here was true, then there was something in his life he had never been told about. The words did not sound like accusation. They sounded like realization forming in real time. Isabella stepped closer, her voice breaking slightly as she insisted that they could not make a life-changing decision based on something that had just appeared in front of them. She reminded him of their future, their families, and everything built toward this moment. But Ethan's attention had already shifted. He looked past her, as if trying to see a timeline that no longer aligned with the present moment. Ava finally spoke again, carefully stating that the child was not part of speculation, but part of medical confirmation through Mercy Children's hospital records. She added that the child, Liam Harper, had been waiting in a hospital room, asking repeatedly for a father he believed existed. The mention of the hospital name caused a visible pause in Ethan's expression once more. This time it was not shock. It was something closer to recognition trying to surface. A guest near the front row stood and quietly suggested that the ceremony should be paused completely until all facts were independently verified. Another voice agreed, but the suggestion no longer mattered. The ceremony had already stopped in everything except name. Ethan slowly closed the envelope and held it at his side. He turned slightly toward Isabella and said in a calm but firm tone that he needed to understand this before continuing anything else. The word understand carried more weight than cancel or postpone. It suggested a shift in priority that could not be ignored. Isabella's eyes widened slightly as she realized what that meant. She asked him if he was walking away from their wedding. Ethan did not answer directly. Instead, he said he was going to the hospital. The room reacted immediately with subtle movement, whispers rising again as the direction of the moment became clear. Ava lowered her gaze slightly, as if acknowledging that her part in this moment had reached its end. Ethan placed the envelope carefully on the altar table, next to the untouched ceremonial arrangement. Then, without looking back at anyone in the room, he turned and began walking down the aisle. Each step echoed differently now, no longer part of the celebration, but part of a departure. Isabella remained standing at the altar, watching him leave without stopping him, her expression caught between disbelief and something she could not yet name. The guests parted silently as he passed, no longer observers of a wedding, but witnesses to its quiet collapse. And by the time Ethan reached the doors, It was already clear that the life he had entered moments ago no longer existed in the same form. The doors of the wedding hall closed behind Ethan Carter with a soft but final sound, cutting him off from the life he had been standing inside only minutes earlier. Outside, the evening air felt colder than expected, as if the shift from celebration to uncertainty had changed even the atmosphere around him. He paused for a moment on the steps, holding the envelope tightly in his hand, while the distant sounds of the city continued unchanged. Behind the glass doors, the ceremony remained frozen in chaos, but Ethan no longer belonged to that space. He walked toward the waiting car without hesitation. The driver quickly opened the door, sensing immediately that something significant had changed. Ethan stepped inside and sat back, exhaling slowly as the door closed. The silence inside the vehicle was heavier than any conversation could have been. He looked down at the envelope again, resting on his lap, as if confirming that it was still real. The driver asked softly where to go, and Ethan replied without delay, saying Mercy Children's Hospital. His voice carried a different tone now, not one of uncertainty, but of direction. The car pulled away from the venue, merging into the city traffic as the wedding building slowly disappeared behind them. Inside the car, Ethan stared out of the window, but his mind was no longer on the streets passing by. It was on the name he could not ignore anymore, Liam Harper. 5 years old, a child in a hospital room, asking for a father he had never known. The thought repeated itself silently, each time becoming harder to dismiss. He opened the envelope once more, reading the DNA confirmation again, but this time there was no search for doubt. Instead, there was a search for meaning. The driver occasionally glanced at the rearview mirror, noticing Ethan's expression but remaining silent. The city lights reflected across the glass, creating brief patterns of movement across Ethan's face as the car moved forward. After several minutes, Ethan spoke again, asking how far the hospital was. The driver responded that it would take approximately 15 minutes, depending on traffic conditions. Ethan nodded slightly, then closed the envelope and placed it beside him on the seat. He leaned back and closed his eyes for a brief moment, but sleep was not what he was seeking. Instead, he saw fragments of unfamiliar images forming in his mind. A child's voice, a hospital room, a name spoken without anger, but with hope. When he opened his eyes again, his expression had changed subtly. The hesitation that had existed earlier was no longer present in the same form. In its place was something quieter but more defined. Responsibility beginning to take shape. The car continued forward through the city streets, passing intersections, buildings, and lights that blurred together into motion. Each passing block brought him closer to something he had never prepared for, but could no longer avoid. Behind him, the world he had just left was still unfolding without him, but ahead of him, another reality was waiting in silence. And for the first time since the DNA test had been placed in his hands, Ethan Carter was no longer asking whether it was true. He was beginning to understand that truth was already moving him forward. The car continued moving through the city, cutting across intersections as traffic lights shifted from red to green in steady rhythm. Inside, Ethan Carter remained quiet, his gaze fixed on the passing lights outside the window, but his thoughts were no longer tied to the present moment. They were anchored somewhere ahead, in a place he had not yet reached but could already feel pulling him forward. The envelope rested beside him on the seat, unopened now, because its contents had already settled inside his mind in a way that paper no longer needed to confirm. The driver maintained a steady pace, occasionally checking the rearview mirror, sensing the weight of silence, but choosing not to interrupt it. After several minutes, Ethan finally spoke again. His voice was calm, but lower than before, as he asked how much longer until they arrived. The driver responded that they were now less than 5 minutes away from Mercy Children's Hospital. That answer created a shift in the air inside the car. Ethan straightened slightly, his posture changing in a way that suggested awareness sharpening into focus. He looked down at his hands briefly, then out at the approaching skyline where the hospital district began to appear in the distance. Tall buildings became fewer, replaced by quieter structures and dimmer streetlights. The environment itself seemed to slow as they entered the area surrounding the hospital. Ethan's expression tightened slightly, not from fear, but from anticipation of something that could no longer be delayed. He reached for the envelope again, not to read it, but to hold it, as if needing physical confirmation of the truth that had redirected his entire night. In the back of his mind, fragments of earlier conversations resurfaced. Ava Johnson standing in the aisle. The DNA confirmation. The name Liam Harper spoken in a silent hall filled with watching eyes. Each memory returned without distortion, as if the mind was organizing events into something irreversible. The car turned onto a quieter street, and the hospital building came into view ahead. It stood illuminated against the night sky, its windows glowing softly, creating a contrast between warmth and distance. Ethan leaned, slightly forward, his attention fully fixed on the structure now visible through the windshield. The driver slowed as they approached the entrance, signaling their arrival. For a brief moment, no one inside the car moved. Ethan looked at the building, then down at the envelope once more. The weight of everything that had happened no longer felt abstract. It had taken physical form in the shape of this destination. He finally spoke, not as a question this time, but as acknowledgement. He said they were here. The driver confirmed quietly and brought the car to a stop near the hospital entrance. Ethan remained seated for a moment longer, staring through the glass at the automatic doors where people moved in and out under soft lighting. Somewhere inside that building was a child who did not know he was about to be seen by the man whose name he had been asking for without ever meeting. Ethan exhaled slowly, then reached for the door handle. As he prepared to step out, the weight of everything he had known before this night no longer defined him. What waited ahead was no longer part of a story he could observe from a distance. It was something he was now required to enter directly. And with that realization, he opened the door and stepped into the night air outside Mercy Children's Hospital. The night air outside Mercy Children's Hospital felt colder than anything Ethan Carter had experienced earlier that evening. As he stepped out of the car, the automatic doors of the hospital entrance opened and closed in a steady rhythm, releasing brief waves of warm light into the exterior darkness. For a moment, he simply stood still, looking at the building as if it represented a threshold between two versions of his life. Behind him, the car engine idled quietly, waiting. Ahead of him, the hospital stood calm and unchanged, unaware of the emotional weight arriving at its doors. Ethan adjusted his jacket slightly and began walking toward the entrance. Each step felt more deliberate than the last, not because he was unsure of direction, but because he was aware that once he crossed that point, nothing would remain abstract anymore. Inside the lobby, the hospital was quiet but active in the distant sense that never fully sleeps. Nurses moved between stations, families sat in waiting areas, and soft overhead announcements blended into the background. Ethan paused just inside the entrance, letting his eyes adjust to the light. The envelope he had carried all evening remained in his hand, though he no longer needed to open it again. The truth inside it had already taken root in his decisions. A hospital staff member at the reception desk briefly noticed him but did not approach, sensing that his presence carried urgency rather than confusion. Ethan looked around, then moved toward the information desk. Before he could speak, Savannah Carter appeared from the side corridor, as if she had been waiting for him. Her expression was calm but attentive, acknowledging immediately that he had arrived. She asked quietly if he was ready. Ethan did not answer directly. Instead, he asked where the child was. Savannah nodded and gestured toward the elevators, indicating the pediatric wing on the third floor. They walked together in silence. The sound of their footsteps blended with the faint mechanical hum of the hospital environment. When they entered the elevator, the doors closed slowly, enclosing them in a small space of stillness. Ethan looked at the panel as the floors began to rise, but his attention was not on numbers anymore. It was on what waited above them. Savannah finally spoke, saying that Liam Harper was currently awake most nights at this hour, often looking out the window and asking questions about people he had never met but believed existed. Ethan listened without interruption. When the elevator reached the third floor, The doors opened to a softly lit corridor decorated with children's drawings and colorful paper decorations. The atmosphere here was different from the lower floors. It carried a sense of fragile hope mixed with quiet endurance. Ethan stepped out first, followed by Savannah. They walked down the hallway together until they reached a door marked 312. A small name tag with handwritten letters was attached beside it. Ethan stopped in front of the door. His hand moved slightly, then paused again before touching the handle. For the first time since leaving the wedding, there was no external interruption, no voices, no documents, no demands. Only the reality of what was about to happen next. From inside the room, a soft child's voice could be heard speaking quietly, asking a question about the night sky outside the window. Ethan closed his eyes briefly, then opened them again. Savannah stepped back slightly, giving him space. The hallway behind them remained still, as if everything had narrowed down to this single moment. Ethan placed his hand on the door handle and turned it slowly. The door began to open, and the light from inside the room spilled gently into the corridor, revealing the beginning of a meeting that would change everything that came after. The door to room 312 opened slowly, releasing a soft wash of warm light into the quiet hospital corridor. Ethan Carter stood at the threshold for a brief moment, as if crossing it required permission from something deeper than himself. Inside the room, the atmosphere was calm and dimly lit, shaped by the steady glow of bedside lamps and the faint blinking of medical monitors. A small child lay in the hospital bed, partially turned toward the window, holding a stuffed toy close to his chest. Liam Harper had not noticed the door opening yet. He was still speaking softly to himself, asking questions about the night sky and whether the moon followed people who were alone. Ethan took a step inside. The door closed behind him with a quiet sound that felt heavier than expected. For a moment, neither he nor the child spoke. Ethan simply stood there, observing the room, the child, and the reality of the situation he had only just begun to accept. Savannah Carter remained outside in the hallway, watching through the slightly open doorway, choosing not to interrupt what was unfolding inside. Liam finally turned his head. His eyes met Ethan's without hesitation or fear. There was only curiosity. He studied the man, standing near the entrance for several seconds before speaking. He asked who he was. The question was simple, but it carried a depth that made Ethan pause before answering. Ethan slowly moved closer to the bed, his steps careful, almost uncertain. He knelt beside the child so that they were at the same level. For a brief moment, he did not speak. Instead, he looked at Liam closely, noticing details he had never seen before but somehow felt familiar. The shape of his eyes, the calm expression, the quiet presence that seemed too grounded for someone so young. Liam tilted his head slightly and repeated his question, asking again who he was. Ethan finally answered in a low voice, saying that he had come to see him. The words felt insufficient, but they were the only ones that existed in that moment. Liam seemed satisfied with the answer for now. He looked down at Ethan's hands, then back up at his face, as if confirming something only he understood. After a few seconds, he asked if Ethan knew about the moon outside. Ethan followed his gaze toward the window. The night sky was visible through the glass, with a faint glow from the city below. He said he had seen it many times, but never like this. Liam nodded as if that was the correct answer. The silence between them was no longer empty. It had begun to shift into something quieter and more meaningful. Ethan slowly reached into his jacket and took out the photograph he had carried from the wedding. He placed it gently on the edge of the bed where Liam could see it clearly. The child leaned forward slightly and looked at the image with focused attention. After a few moments, he pointed at the boy in the picture and smiled softly, saying that he looked like him. Ethan did not respond immediately. Instead, he simply nodded, accepting the truth without resistance. Savannah remained near the doorway, her expression softened by what she was witnessing. The hospital room felt smaller now, not because of its size, but because of how closely everything within it mattered. Ethan carefully adjusted the blanket around Liam, ensuring he was comfortable. The child did not let go of his presence, nor did he seem to want to. Outside the window, the moon remained steady in the night sky, unchanged and silent. Inside the room, something long absent had finally begun to take shape again, not through explanation or confirmation, but through presence. Alone, and in that quiet exchange between a man and a child who had never met before, the distance between truth and belonging began to disappear. The room remained still after the small smile faded from Liam Harper's face, as if even time inside Mercy Children's Hospital had slowed down to preserve the moment. Ethan Carter remained kneeling beside the bed, his presence steady but visibly changed, no longer shaped by uncertainty, but by something quieter and more permanent. The child's hand still rested in his, not gripping tightly, but not letting go either, as if instinctively recognizing a connection that did not require explanation. Savannah Carter stood near the partially open doorway, watching in silence, her expression reflecting a mixture of relief and quiet understanding, as if she had witnessed something long overdue finally take its place in reality. Ethan looked at Liam again, studying him not as a question anymore, but as an answer that had taken time to arrive. He asked softly if the child felt comfortable with him being there. Liam nodded without hesitation and said yes in a simple voice, as though the presence of Ethan was no longer unfamiliar, but something that belonged naturally in the room. That response created a stillness that felt different from everything that had come before it, no longer filled with shock or disbelief, but with acceptance forming in real time. Ethan slowly shifted closer to the bed, careful not to disturb the medical wires or the child's comfort, and gently adjusted the blanket again, a gesture that carried more meaning than words could express. He asked if Liam often stayed awake looking at the sky, and the child confirmed it with a small nod, adding that the moon felt like it was watching over him when he felt alone. Ethan looked toward the window again, where the night sky remained visible, the same moon still hanging above the city, unchanged but now shared between them. He said quietly that he understood that feeling. The words were simple, but they carried a depth that filled the space between them in a way nothing else had. Liam relaxed slightly into the pillow, still holding on to Ethan's presence as if it had always been meant to arrive at this exact moment. Savannah took a small step back into the hallway, allowing the room to belong fully to them without interruption. Ethan reached out and carefully smoothed the child's hair, a gentle motion that reflected something new forming within him, not obligation, but recognition. He remained silent for a moment, then spoke again, saying that he was there now and would not leave. The promise was not dramatic, but it was firm enough to settle into the atmosphere of the room. Liam did not respond with words, only closing his eyes briefly, as if absorbing the reassurance completely. The monitors continued their steady rhythm, the only sound marking the passage of time. Outside the window, the city continued moving, unaware of what had just shifted inside this small hospital room. Inside, however, nothing remained the same as before. Ethan stayed beside the bed, no longer as a visitor, but as someone beginning to understand his place in a life he had never known existed. And in the quiet that followed, where no further explanation was needed, the distance between absence and belonging finally ceased to exist.